Welcome to Adopting Zero Trust, an independent podcast that dives into the world of zero trust and tells the story of people who are adopting it. Throughout our series, we'll investigate why zero trust is becoming a critical concept for cybersecurity. Our hosts, Elliot Volkman and Neil Dennis, will have transparent and open conversations with the people driving modern security approaches forward, while leaving vendor hype behind. It's time to remove implicit trust and buzzwords and get to the root of the movement.
Yeah, whatever you prefer. We can do an audio-only version. We do publish a YouTube version as well,
Oh,
but
sweet.
like
Okay, yeah, that's
people generally listen instead of like
yeah.
I'll just turn these into like preview clips or something.
They can only stare
Cool.
at this so much before they get sick and tired of it. So it's all
Yeah,
good.
yeah, because
They come for the beard.
yeah, there you go. Yeah, I get despite being in Silicon Valley, our internet connection is crappy. We have awful broadband. Partly because of this particular spot I live. I live up on a hill, and then behind me there's like an open area, and then a PG&E, our local utility, has a substation back there, and all the poles have to go through the PG&E facility, which means like no one wants to string fiber through because they got to deal with the utilities. So we have Xfinity, which just not
Trash.
Yeah,
That's what I got.
They're
Pure
fiber
trash.
to the node. They're not fiber to the door. Fiber to the node.
Yeah,
Happy note.
Well, we're
I have
live.
fiber to my house. So before
that's
we really
sweet.
get diving in, one last little thing. You live
Show
in
off.
the tech hub of the world. I live with 180 acres worth of cattle and literal bird shit all around me. I have 1 gig fiber internet. So with that, let's go
That's
ahead and kick
sweet.
it off.
Oh man, this is going to be the weirdest intro ever because we're already having the conversation. So welcome to Adopting Zero Trust, or AZT. Today, as with you've probably noticed to our wonderful listeners, we're constantly changing up the format. This week, we have a academic, someone with an intense background on the federal side, and really we're going to hone in on, I don't want to say in a pessimistic tone, but maybe a lack of innovation in government around cybersecurity. So that's the focal point of what we're going to be chatting through today. But so AJ comes to us with a significant amount of background. He's currently a fellow over at Stanford University. He's a director, leads cybersecurity over at Turtle Rock Studios. And for you gamers out there, if you're familiar with Back 4 Blood and Left 4 Dead, that's those folks. Did a stint with NIST, and of course, a security director of cybersecurity policy with the White House. So just a few things. I probably heard of some of those. Probably has a really good understanding of that divide between high-tech organizations who need to be on the cutting edge and then also the federal side. So that brings us back to our conversation focal point today, which again is really about what innovation in the federal government space around cybersecurity looks like, which is fantastic because right now we are running off the tail end of the new national cybersecurity strategy, which puts some of the onus on software developers, vendors, service providers to be more secure. So they're taking more of a potential carrot versus a stick approach. But what that also does is also emphasize how much energy and focus needs to be put into cybersecurity. So they're clearly extending either that stick or carrot. They're trying to build those partnerships even greater with the private sector. But that's where we are today. So AJ, I'd love for you to give yourself a little bit of an introduction, making sure that I don't accidentally call up the wrong school again. Yeah, let's learn a little bit more about you.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, guys. It's good to be here. Yeah, as you said, I lead a research and teaching program on cyber policy at Stanford, where I've been camped out since 2017 after moving west from Washington, D.C., where, as you indicated, I had a bunch of experience in the federal government, including Capitol Hill. I worked in the Senate, on the Senate Intelligence Committee staff, and fairly typical DC fashion. I worked at a think tank too, so I've kind of I've got the concert tee, DC experience with all my stops, on the back. And yeah, now I focus my time on research and teaching, and then I do some consulting here and there for companies who are thinking about some of the problems that we're going to talk about today.
Excellent. Love it. So just kind of jumping straight into it, if you had to sum up the current systems and your understanding based on your experience dealing with that federal side, how realistic is it to say that there is a pure lack of innovation versus it's just such a monstrosity of a beast to be able to move things forward in regards to cybersecurity and infrastructure around that.
Yeah, well, I would say there's an awful lot of innovation. It just oftentimes happens at a slower pace. It can be difficult to scale, right? So, one agency or another agency may have, some great idea for how to, streamline their IT operations, bring new services to customers and stakeholders, defend their systems more effectively. But it can be difficult to scale that learning across the federal enterprise. And then the biggest reason why is inertia. It can be easy to pick on government for being, slower than the private sector. Although I think in many cases the private sector is not always, not always fast when it comes to adopting new technologies. It really depends. But the federal government has, these layers of legal and regulatory requirements for how it procures IT, how it manages IT, how it pays for IT. And so, the people who are making procurement decisions, the people who are operating IT and OT, I should say, within the federal enterprise, they have a really hard job. And so, it's and inertia has an awful lot to do with it. Again, there's just a lot of requirements and bureaucracy, oftentimes imposed by Congress, that the executive branch, federal government, has to navigate.
So, real quick on that note, some of the things you're talking about speed and ease or lack thereof of change from the government side and vice versa. It's spot on. Having a government background myself and having sat in many things to see this, but I still find it's always amazing to me that the industry, the private sector, can come up with some good ideas. There's a couple of early adopters, obviously, early, getting things going, but nothing really starts to get towards that wonderful S-curve economics of adoption, power curve there, until the government itself comes down and starts making it a buzzword, right? I think that's probably partially indicative of our larger scale economic actually being tied to government procedures in general, right? Whether we claim to be or not. But, point in case, like with Zero Trust as a whole, there's been companies for a couple of years that have been touting the construct, even pre-executive order, but nobody's really paid much attention to it until the executive order came down and really said, hey, this is a concept. And I mean, you and I both know it's still going to be years or longer before the government officially validates what that truly means across the globe. Minor standards now, major things later. But, kind of your thoughts on that adoption curve. The government may still be slow, but once they decide to take some kind of notice of whatever that new thing is, regardless of how long it takes them to get there afterwards, I personally tend to see the private sector ramp up massively quickly. Your thoughts on kind of that take on business? Once the government says go, the whole world snaps to, or not?
I think you've got to distinguish big companies from little companies in terms of how quickly they adopt technology, and also the particular sector that a company is in. All those factors can all affect how readily they can and quickly they can adopt new technology. So, in some areas like financial services, for example, which is a highly regulated sector, we just had a couple banks collapse here in the United States, including one in our neighborhood out here, Silicon Valley Bank. That's a reminder that that as frustrating as regulations can be. I mean, they when done properly, they do serve a purpose. And banks, because of that regulatory overhang, are more conservative when it comes to adopting new technology, because they have to make sure that new technology is going to allow them to continue to comply with the various laws that they're subject to. So, for example, record-keeping requirements that exist to police insider trading. A bank that wants to adopt a new technology has got to figure out, okay, how do we, is this consistent with, can we adopt this new technology and still have it be consistent with our legal requirements? Other sectors that, aren't as regulated, have a lot more freedom. So you think big tech companies that, they tend to be quicker at adopting new technology, partly because of their management culture, but also because they're just less regulated and have more degrees of freedom. And then, in terms of that's just a sector comparison. And then big companies and small companies. I'm not sure you can generalize it. It's easier for big or small companies to adopt new technology, but I do think that There's a resource factor as well as a management kind of a culture factor. Small to medium sized businesses obviously typically face more cost constraints. So technology that's all things equal more expensive to implement, maybe more difficult for a small to medium sized enterprises. But for technology that is cost effective, small to medium sized enterprises may have the advantage of having sort of fewer decision points, fewer sort of bureaucratic veto points on change, and could move faster. So I think I think it's safe to generalize that yes, the government tends to be slower than the private sector, but I also would characterize that as a trend, not a law of physics. Then when it comes to your point on adoption, there's sort of a correlation causation question here. It could be that, so in some cases when the government adopts a new technology, it sends a signal to the marketplace that this technology is safe, or in some cases that actually if you don't use this technology, right, you may subject yourself to liability risk. Multi-factor authentication is an example, right, where the government's been pushing this as a matter of policy. It itself has implemented it. I think now there's sort of a collective zeitgeist that if you're a company and you have sensitive data, business operations, you're not using two-factor multi-factor authentication, you're probably not up to snuff when it comes to meeting industry standards. But also, the government adoption could also just be that, look, I mean, they're following trends in the marketplace too, and so it's not that the government's causing the market to adopt it. It's actually the government's part of that market and part of the trend of broader adoption.
Yeah, I could agree with that. That's definitely good insights. So, kind of thinking about adoption paths. I've personally consulted with some Fortune 50 companies. I've worked with a lot smaller companies than that. And to your point, that there's a lot of things that obviously go into that hurdle in the decision making process. It's more than just money. It's people. It's who's been there for 20 years and has an idea that this works better than that, doesn't want to change, versus who comes in and is able to make changes when and where applicable. The who's the better spokesman for whatever the new construct is, as well as being able to get the money. But yeah, I've seen Fortune 50 companies that have two people in their SOC and managed services as a primary. And then I've seen companies that are lucky to break 750 that run a 24/7, 365. Yeah. Yeah. But, it's just a matter of prioritization and principle, right? It's not like the one running the MSSP is technically getting less. They've just prioritized how they want to handle it differently. And that's fine. If it gets you at least the same check boxes, whether you're compliance driven or compliance and security driven, then props to you, I guess. So no, that's pretty good stuff. So I have a curiosity question. So around your gaming background, and maybe we're a little early to ask about this, but I am very curious. So, early on before we kind of kicked off the recording, you were talking about some of the hurdles that you were more or less hired to indirectly impact and overcome because of the merger of the gaming or the buyout, I guess, probably more aptly, from Tencent. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit more around kind of what that meant for you and some of the hurdles that you've probably had to see or overcome in respect to your security posturing and all the regulatory junk that you've obviously had to deal with because of that Chinese presence?
Well, to me, the experience has reinforced how there's an incredible diversity of IT environments out there, and the IT environment within a gaming studio is way different than an environment in a bank, for example. The tools are different, the workflows are different, and the challenge from a security perspective is regardless of the company, how does management identify risks, decide what level of risk to accept or not, decide where to invest in risk mitigation, and that process is ultimately a human. Come back to your point earlier about people, right? I mean, that's a people driven process. There's a lot of hype around AI tools helping decision makers make more informed decisions about their risk posture, but even then, humans are still going to be the ones making decisions. Management culture, management leadership is, I think, by far the most important factor. Whether it's a video game studio, whether it's a bank, whether it's a small grocery store business, right? In terms of managing risk, any risk, but especially IT risk.
No, well said. So on that journey, some of the things that once again, fair points about infrastructure. I think these are key things for people to understand. Is back to one of the reasons why Elliot and I are doing this, because no one's journey is going to be the same going down the zero trust rabbit hole or any security rabbit hole. And if you're trying to take a model from company A to copy paste to company B simply because you have the same dollar signs or you happen to be in the same industry vertical, good luck, right? But there are obviously lessons to be learned. So in your journey here a little bit from the IT side with the gaming company, how does that kind of impact y'all from the idea of zero trust or better security postures, especially with the international presence? Like, I mean, what are some of your maybe key concerns or some of your key findings that you think have been pretty impactful along that part as well, knowing infrastructure is way different than financial services, to your point, and some of these people, I'm imagining, given what I know about the engineers I work with and programmers, they don't like to come to the office unless they have to. So there's a lot of potential remote stuff. There's a lot of potential PII for what y'all are doing. And I would say, given one last thing, the success of what the company has done in the past, there's probably a lot of people who are potentially actively engaged in trying to exploit something for insights or other stuff. So anyway, all that to say, compared to financial services, which is, they're there, they understand how to stop web injects, all this other crap. But how does that impact you from a gaming infrastructure and that cultural mentality to overcome that from doing things zero trust-esque and stuff of that nature?
Well, I'll say, the IT leadership team within the company is first rate, and the the culture of a gaming studio is this will be maybe a little bit of a theme is unique. I mean, compared to a bank, for example, at a studio, I would summarize it. It's a workforce of creatives, right? So these are people who are developing narratives for games, people who are designing worlds and vehicles and weapons and character skins and all that kind of cool stuff that makes a game visually appealing with a compelling narrative and an intuitive gameplay. Those and your creatives, I mean, I think there's a constant sort of, and I would say healthy tug of war between the need to facilitate creativity, the need to eliminate sort of friction and transaction costs to people doing their jobs, and then of course making sure that the systems are appropriately locked down, that that, to your point, adversaries can't get in, whether they're malicious insiders or outside threat actors. I mean, that's actually a challenge that exists for really any organization that wants to adopt zero trust. And this again comes back into sort of the management cultural factor. How one goes about, implementing zero trust in a video game studio, in the federal government, pick your sector, it's going to look different. And, it again, I think it all comes back to management, leadership culture.
So, I mean, with that kind of in mind, I think for some of the listeners, it's important to highlight that, minus the fact that you're tied to a Chinese entity and there's some regulatory requirements there, y'all as a company are more or less kind of pure power play, private DIY. There's not probably a whole lot of blatant rules and regulations for what makes you other than just normal standards, I imagine. And so back to financial services, there's a lot of regulatory things there that keep them what they are, that security standards, implementations, interactions with ISACs, government entities, all that other stuff that, if they miss a day doing such and such, then they get obliterated, they get fined, they get brought out in the news, they get shamed, whatever, right? But for a company like y'all, I imagine, that there's probably a higher level of just self-ownership of this process to make things better, right? You kind of look at it from a lens of what makes sense for us versus what the government's enforcing us to do. Is that fairly accurate as a whole?
Yeah, well, there are, so, in the case of Studio, we're subject to a national security agreement that the company negotiated with the Department of Justice and the Department of Treasury, pursuant to this CFIUS, this foreign investment review process as a result of the Tencent acquisition. The details of the national security agreement are confidential. I can't go into really any details about them, but they're reasonable, and I think if you maybe taking a step back, really, I think the question, the big policy question is, okay, under what circumstances are we as a country comfortable with a private actor operating under purely private economic motivations make risk decisions versus, okay, are there circumstances where either we don't trust the private sector to make the right decision, or maybe there are other factors that are in play that where a public policy view of what is an acceptable level of risk may be different from what the company does. And so, to take critical infrastructure as an example, right? So think about the electricity subsector of our economy, right? Huge. I mean, we all rely on, and it's a pretty heavily regulated sector. Although I will say, cybersecurity is a relatively late arrival in terms of regulatory focus. I'd say last 15 years or so, with greater focus. And the reason why we may not quote unquote trust a utility, most of which are privately owned, to make the right risk decision is because the difference between, so if the power goes out, the company suffers a loss of revenue. That is a loss that they are able to internalize, right? The company's like, okay, we get this. On the other hand, like, the costs to society are much bigger than that. So big that, why would a rational utility factor that bigger cost, which doesn't affect them, it affects their customers, into their internal risk mitigation investment decisions? And by the way, they may conclude, look, if it gets so bad, we'll just go bankrupt, right? So again, why would we pay, before to mitigate if in the end we won't ultimately be responsible for paying the costs? And it's those kinds of problems where I think regulation is advisable. Now, figuring out how to craft regulations that are proportional to the problem and tailored to the problem that the regulations are trying to solve is another matter. It's possible, it's eminently possible for there to be a need for regulation and for government to screw up, how the regulations are designed and implemented. But there are always going to be circumstances where, companies aren't going to internalize the cost of the risk decisions. And in those cases, maybe there's a need for government.
Well, it's kind of funny because I think on our very last episode that we just recorded, we kind of went down this a little bit. And, one of the analogies or similarities and hopes of what we're seeing now was with like the banking industry with respect to credit card fraud and debit card fraud, pick a flavor, right? And that's a privately regulated decision around what they decided to do originally around, if your card gets popped for $10, you're not going to hire a lawyer. You're not going to hire an investigator, right? But they've made that part of their business risk decision because they know long term, a $10 pop turns into $1 million, turns into $10 million kind of thing from the same threat actor. So they took ownership of the fraud, reimburse you for what's there, and then they go out and do the larger investigation with whoever their LE counterparts are in order to do that stuff. And then as part of their own internal, depending on the size of the bank, they may or may not have already done some of that legwork before giving it over to FBI or whoever. But that's slightly different in respect to, like you mentioned, if the power goes out or if the gas gets shut down and we don't have any gas pipelines flowing for whatever reason, you're right that's a little bit different risk assessment from a cost benefit analysis that they've done. And I agree from a regulatory perspective, it makes a lot more sense for those critical infrastructure type things to have that tie-in. I think that's the other thing for people to understand is that when it comes to critical infrastructure key resources, like you mentioned, there is a lot of regulatory things that apply to the uptime and availability of those types of things and those solutions specifically, so that way day-to-day life moves on. When the pipeline went out, that obviously impacted gas prices nationally and then eventually globally for a couple of weeks. And that was one single pipeline, right? Stuff coming down to Houston or up from Houston rather. And that's what really stunk here in Central Texas. It wasn't like we were getting that fuel, but because of the lack of stuff going out, the state had to compensate and supply to push things a different route. So, even the state that was producing but not consuming still got impacted by something as simple as that. And the other part was it wasn't like the pipeline itself was really down. It was billing and infrastructure to support that really was ultimately impacted. And that's what. So I'm saying all this because that's kind of what I think got us into where we're at with all these recent regulatory requirements over the last couple of years. Yeah. And I believe personally that's kind of what got us to the government constructing their first, zero trust mentality model, because they had all these regulatory requirements now that are there that say if you're part of CIKR and you get any kind of breach, no matter what it is, you have to report within X hours, right? And that was kind of already there, but then that got us into the software bill of sales, courtesy of SolarWinds and all the other crap that we put up with the last couple of years. So anyway, I think that's kind of our path. Is we've just had a lot of critical issues that weren't regulated very, very well that impacted global economics. And now the government stepped in to regulate, because unlike parts of the banking industry that self-regulate for the sake of risk mitigation on our behalf, to your point, that really wasn't there, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, and I think it's, incentives matter. It's a, kind of a trite thing to say, but they do. And if we look at the risk decisions that actors, organizations make in the marketplace, they're driven by incentives. You mentioned credit card, fraud, and there's actually a really interesting case study comparing the incidence of credit card fraud in the United Kingdom versus the United States. And so, as you mentioned, here in the United States, the credit card companies are on the hook for covering fraudulent transactions using the card, right? So if you or I, our card gets hacked and used, we're not liable. Like, the credit card company is going to cover that for us. In the UK, it was the burden fell on the consumer to prove that there was a fraud, which is hard to do if you're just an ordinary consumer, right? So if your account gets hacked and your credit card gets used, your number gets stolen and used, you've got to prove that those transactions work. That's really hard. And so, not surprisingly, the banks invested a whole lot less in credit card fraud mitigation, including a lot of cybersecurity capabilities in the UK than they did in the United States. Why? Because in the United States, the banks felt those costs. In the UK, the banks were able to pass those costs on to their customers. And so why invest if you're not going to pay the costs? And and I think these incentives problems are legion, in the cybersecurity world. You mentioned the software bill of materials. There's a classic work in economics by George Akerlof, who actually ended up winning the Nobel Prize in economics for this, where this is an article, I think he put it out in 1970, where he imagined a marketplace for used automobiles. Some of these automobiles are identical in every way, except some of them are peaches, some of them are lemons. Peaches are good cars. Lemons have something wrong in them. And what he argued, and I think proved, was if you have a market where customers can't tell the difference between a peach and a lemon, what are they going to be willing to pay for a car? Well, somewhere in between those two prices. Well, then all of a sudden, owners of peaches are going to be like, look, if I put my peach in the marketplace, I'm not going to get the full value. Why would I then bother to sell it? And what happens then is peaches get pulled from the market, and you end up with a market of lemons only. And there are a lot of people, myself included, who believe that the software market is the market for lemons, because it's really hard for consumers to differentiate products on the basis of their security attributes. And when that's the case, you end up with an ecosystem of, all things equal, relatively bad software from a security perspective. And the software bill of materials is designed to fix this, right? By bringing more transparency, by resolving what economists would call information asymmetry between buyers and sellers of cars in Akerlof's case, but in our case, software.
Yes, that brings to mind a good question that I don't think we've really completely asked in a while. So from a standards perspective, when we think about zero trust, do you see a future, and the answer's kind of already slightly there, but do you see a future where, from a regulatory perspective outside of the government industry and connections, where there's more certification paths, more, hey, look at us, we have a stamp of approval, like pick a flavor of regulation, this is our proof that we've done it, and that we claim to be zero trust, and here's what we say it means to be zero trust by X third party standard? And do you see that market space opening up a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, it's a growth industry, and I think especially when it comes to systems that also have AI ML components in them, there's a big push in that space as well to audit all algorithms for bias and for other problematic attributes. And I'll be honest with you, on the one hand, I love the idea of certification and audits, because they help resolve this information asymmetry problem that I mentioned. But audits can be gamed, certifications can be gamed, and the broader economy as well as the IT part of the economy have lots of examples where clever organizations have gamed audit, or where audit hasn't fulfilled its objectives because of problems with either interest between the auditors and those who are being audited. As one example, coming back to the incentives theme, a big problem with audit is if I am let's imagine I'm a company and I want to get an audit of my, actually, let me say I'm a company and I have a software product that I want audited against some standard, right? And I'm probably going to pay some third party auditor to perform that certification for me. Now, third party auditors are businesses typically. They're out to make money. Their revenue is derived from doing audits. Think about the incentive structure here, right? And the conflict of interest. Auditors want repeat business. If they get a reputation for being too hard, they're not going to get repeat business. So you got to be careful, right? And that's not to say that all auditors are suspect, but there is that incentives problem there, and part of the answer is having accreditation for auditors, training, ethics requirements, enforcement of ethics requirements. But now we're talking about a bigger, more expensive ecosystem, meaning that the cost of an audit also goes up. And so, this is, again, I think you asked, okay, is this market going to take up? I think the answer is yes, because there's a lot of money to be made, in audit, especially for people who are selling audits.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, I agree. I think Elliot and I are going to shift trajectories here financially. We're going to start the first official zero trust audit company, third party independent
Nice,
researchers.
congratulations! Great.
Don't tell that to my parentship company because they'll kill me immediately. Oh my gosh! So I don't really talk about it often, but I do work for Grotto, which very much is in that house where we help facilitate the audit process before the audit to make sure that they're good there. But this is too timely of a conversation where AICPA actually just put out a signal flare, I think 3 weeks ago, indicating that not just as you're indicating that there might be conflict of interest between, I think they're calling it service organization versus the auditor, but there's also that software layer. And I got to be very careful so I don't get myself in trouble. But yeah, there are definitely organizations who have auditors who actually are connected to that agreement, which that completely defeats the whole third party neutralized approach. So yeah, it's just a very timely factor. It's pretty clear that organizations like AICPA are flagging these things too. So there are multiple conflicts of interest factors in there. But yeah, maybe after I eventually get myself in trouble and get fired, we'll build up our own zero trust audit firm.
No, I think personally, I think we're on track to become the next Hacker Valley Media and maybe grow faster than Chris and crew over there and buy them out. And real quick, shameless plug in, not shameless, but purposeful plug for them. If y'all are looking for some fun stuff, just shout out to our friends over at the Hacker Valley Media and Studios. They run some really good content, and Chris Cochran's former Marine like myself and a Netflix Intel guy when he got off active duty. So anyway, that in mind, yeah, there's a lot of weird things regulatory. I think it's hilarious. I do agree. I've seen auditors come in, and every once in a while you do get the hard butt one that's just like, man, y'all suck, and we're not you need to fix all this. I'm like, thank you for being truthful. But by and large, most of them are. I wouldn't even call them consultative. Consultative would at least say, hey, here's what's wrong. We're going to help you fix it, and then charge you for it and do all this. There are some who do that too.
Yeah. But
by and large, most are like, hey, here's what's wrong, and if you fix it, quote unquote, within 2 days to where we can't see it, you'll pass the audit check, right? And really, what does that mean? You just unplug the device for the next time they run the audit check, and the device is no longer active. Crap like that. And then they're like, oh, congratulations. And yeah, I agree. It's a weird slope, and your mileage does vary. But I am looking forward to seeing, now that we have some government regulation standards of sorts, rather behind some of this, some ideas around NIST for what zero trust means. I am very curious to see what the rest of this year holds for audit companies that, one, claim zero trust as process flow, but two, start trying to develop their own standards. What are those going to look like, and who's really going to come out on top as the one who gets the first government paycheck?
Well, there's a need for it because think about business partners, right? Let's imagine you and I are business partners. You say you've got I'm going to be transferring data to you, sensitive information, and as part of our contract negotiation, I'm going to want to know, okay, how are you going to protect that, right? And you come back and say, well, I've got zero trust. I'm going to say, prove it. And that's where audit comes in. I mean, so there's going to be, a huge demand for this. And as I appreciate your points about, both of your points about, the need to structure those relationships in a way that ensures that the stakeholders are getting good information out of the audit, much of which has to do with there being like auditable criteria, that we can sort of point to objectively. Yes, you either are or are not meeting this requirement. That, by the way, has been a big problem in the federal contracting space, especially for DoD. And that would be a whole other podcast.
No, that's awesome. So I think we're kind of coming up on time. So I'm going to let Elliot say his piece real quick and see if there's anything else that he wanted to cover before I take us off on a whole nother tangent.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is just a really good topic to fall down our rabbit holes in. But I just want to bring up maybe a point that we flagged from our last episode, which was with Alana Cohen and Tony Scott, where we talk about national cybersecurity strategy. One of the elements that seems to be a really critical blocker for innovation at the government level are budgets. So, having been in those shoes, having dealt with where that lives, do you feel that it makes sense to the government try to find a pathway? The budget tied to cybersecurity is outside of the realm of that giant bucket that everything else is in, because it does create obviously blockers. They put out that strategy. Are they able to execute on it? Not until they approve the budget. But yeah, I'd love your input and your perspective on, how that functions.
Well, yeah, I mean, I know both Tony and Alana, and Tony in particular, when he was federal CIO, developed this revolving capital fund idea for federal IT that was a great idea, and Congress implemented part of it. I wish they would go the whole way. The idea is that this could basically borrow against a revolving capital fund to modernize their IT and then pay it back. That would help them get out of the sort of annual kind of do loop of federal budgeting for IT, which isn't very well suited to sort of long-term, recapitalization decisions. Should back up. A big problem the government has is legacy IT. This big legacy IT overhang, and because we, for many years, it's gotten better actually over the last 5 or 6 years. And I actually give the Trump administration a lot of credit. They actually put a lot of work into trying to recapitalize federal IT. But we had this tax that we had to pay to maintain legacy IT, outdated, more expensive to maintain, and this revolving capital fund, which exists, is just in relatively small amounts, is one way to help kind of address that problem.
Very cool. Yeah, I've not been aware of that, but I love that we're able to kind of overlap from that last conversation, kind of dig back in. So that said, we are unfortunately at time, but we are definitely going to have to find a way to bring you back. Your balance between working on the federal side and working with, creative studios that you're at right now, and being an academic, there's that piece too. Obviously, there's just a lot of really good perspective here that we really appreciate you providing that insight and expertise with our audience. So thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
It's good to be here, guys. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you, AJ. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for joining AZT, an independent series. Your hosts have been Elliot Volkman and Neil Dennis. To learn more about Zero Trust, go to adoptingzerotrust.com, subscribe to our newsletter, or join our Slack community. Viewpoints expressed during the show do not reflect the brands, employers, or companies of our hosts, guests, or potential sponsors.